Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. I think the thing we miss most often about today's story is that any time it was told, the people listening probably would have broken out in laughter. This week we are looking at the stories of Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Galilee during his life of ministry, and today's story is a favorite for many. It's the story of the Gerasene demoniac. You probably know the story, but here it is again in Mark 5. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes, and when he had stepped out of the boat, immediately a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain, for he had often been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him, and he shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he had said to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." He begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now there on the hillside a great herd of swine was feeding, and the unclean spirits begged him, "Send us into the swine, let us enter them." So he gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. The swineherds ran off and told it in the city and in the country. Then people came to see what it was that had happened. They came to Jesus and saw the demoniac sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had had the legion, and they were afraid. Those who had seen what had happened to the demon and to the swine reported it. Then they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by demons begged him that he might be with him. But Jesus refused and said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. Now, the funny thing is, when we read that story, we don't find anything particularly funny. At least not that would make us laugh and laugh and laugh. In fact, one thing we might think is that the owners of those pigs sure weren't laughing. But we forget the times. The Jews had all sorts of dietary laws, and everyone knew that the most famous one was that pork was considered unclean. It was forbidden for an observant Jew to eat anything that came from a pig. Hold on to that thought for a moment while I remind you that Israel was under occupation by the Romans at this time, and cohorts of Roman soldiers were called legions. So when this story winds up with a demon named Legion, everyone would have thought about how they were demonized by the Roman soldiers. And then when Legion ended up destroyed in a bunch of unclean pigs, well, that's a knee slapper if there ever was one. The image would have tickled them all, and they would have enjoyed this little jibe at the expense of the Romans. Unfortunately, we tend to miss that because it's not part of our world. There are lots of serious parts in this story too. It's important to note how Jesus treated the demoniac differently than the townspeople. Rather than ostracizing him and staring at him, Jesus loved him. Jesus healed him and made him whole. It's also interesting to note that the townspeople asked Jesus to leave them alone. They didn't want this guy who could do such things, destroying other people's herds and flocks, or who knew what else he might do. It's bad enough to have a man with a demon around. This could be worse. Well, one of the most interesting parts is right at the end of the story. The man who had the demon wanted to follow Jesus, but Jesus sends him on his way to tell others what Jesus had done for him. That's odd because so many times Jesus tells people not to tell what he has done. But that's where geography comes into play. You see, Jesus had just crossed the lake, and the territory he was in wasn't part of Israel. It is believed that in Israel, Jesus told people not to tell about what he does because they would have had expectations for who and what the Messiah would be, expectations that were different from what Jesus came to be and do. But here, he's not in Israel, and there aren't those misguided expectations. So Jesus urges this man to tell the news. I don't think it really matters if we are by the sea or in the mountains or wherever. We are called now and always to tell the story of God's love. It's not a laughing matter. It's a matter of joy. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.